and that identity is made, then the main contours of the common patristic interpretation actually follow. If this is a rescue story, then the half-dead man represents those who are in need of saving, who have fallen into sin. Here's a rescuer who does not just happen to find a man on the road, but is going out in search of people in need. Why else is he carrying a first aid kit with him anyway? Origen makes this point. He says there may be many other people in similar straits that the Samaritan is out there to rescue. On this reading, the end to which rescued humanity is brought can really be nothing other than the church. The 2 coins are undeserved gifts that become means of caretaking while this person is in the inn. So maybe it's knowledge of the Father and Son. Maybe it's the 2 sacraments. Okay, there's variation in the interpretations there. Other details may vary as they are subordinate to the principal elements of the story. So the allegorical interpretation, I would also add, does not preclude the moral interpretation, that the call to Christian action that we're familiar with. To the half-dead ones out there, go and do likewise could mean something like, be rescued by the loving Savior. Alternatively, and more commonly, go and do likewise is a mandate to God's people to be the Samaritan, to go out and show their love by finding people in need, binding up their wounds, bearing their burdens. But as Origen also affirmed, when one imitates the Samaritan of the parable by loving one's neighbors, such a one is simply imitating Christ. In either case, whether we see ourselves as the half-dead man or as the Samaritan, the traditional patristic interpretation of the Samaritan as Christ still illustrates neighbor love and is still applicable to Christians. The last thing I'll say, and I'm over time, so I'll wrap it up with this, is that true meaning is not bound to or limited by human authorial intent for Augustine. Or more precisely, I would say, our hypothesis regarding that intent. Because human authorial intent is something we can actually never really know for sure. It's hard to know enough to know the intentions of the people we can sit here and talk with face to face. So to say with some kind of, I would call it arrogance almost, to say, well, we know exactly what the author intended every time is a tough prospect in some instances. So that is a true interpretation, may not necessarily be the one sole intent or true meaning of the human author. So for Augustine's interpretation to be true, it was not necessary for Jesus and the original audience to have in mind every detail of the story as he laid it out. Although he thinks it's a correct interpretation, Augustine never claims to be giving the one true interpretation of the story that excludes all others and that Jesus had in mind when he gave this parable. In fact, in at least 5 other places, Augustine interprets the parable as a simple moral story whose intent is to show that every neighbor is to be loved, which corresponds with the straightforward interpretation that modern scholars usually give. So, as I note, this moral interpretation is not incompatible with the allegorical. There's just not one interpretation. So the allegorical interpretation, I already said, is not just the Augustinians, the patristic, but I would also add it's not the Augustinian interpretation. It's an Augustinian interpretation. Augustine does not seem overly concerned with which precise meaning Jesus or Luke had in mind. If I had more time, I would go in and tell you that even on this reading, I think, there are indications in the text itself that, interrupt myself here and say, pre-modern people were actually more concerned with authorial intent and even historical matters than we usually give them credit for. Okay? Certainly they're less concerned about it than modern interpreters, but it is a factor for them. But I think you can see even in Luke, in the text of Luke chapter 10, that you could read this and say, maybe there is an intent there to open the doors to a broader application. I mean, it's interesting that Jesus, when he's asked the question, who is my neighbor, he could have just straightforwardly said, everyone, even Samaritans. But he told a story. Story already invites imaginative interpretation. And it's not even straightforward in the story, because the one who you would think is the neighbor you do good to, the person who's in need, the half-dead man, okay, who was beat up, is not the one he says at the end was the neighbor. The neighbor was the one who did good to the other. So there are lots of ambiguities in the story itself that I would say invite imaginative application. You see this in the Gospel of Luke as well, and other parables, like in chapter 15, when it comes to identifying people in the story. In Luke 15, you got the parable of the prodigal son. Elder son, younger son, right? Well, in the context of that chapter, before those three famous parables, Luke says in the first two verses of chapter 15 that there were two groups listening to Jesus. One was the tax collectors and sinners, and the other was the Pharisees. And the latter was grumbling against the former. And then you go on and read a parable about the elder son grumbling against the younger son. Now, the parable doesn't end with an interpretation, but you can't read that without fairly interpreting and identifying those two groups with the elder and younger son. And then you take a little more and say, well, what did Luke have in mind? Context of Luke Acts, a concern with the inclusion of Gentiles. Now who's the elder son and the younger son? Maybe the Jews and Gentiles, respectively. There's an intent in the story itself, as there was in all ancient literature, for it to be applied in a broader situation to potential hearers and readers in the future and in other places. So what I'm saying is, maybe the fact that Jesus just told a story opens it up to, there's an intent to go beyond my intent by giving a story here. Okay? And in that case, then maybe Augustine's not that far off on doing something true, not the only truth, but true with this parable. There may be many wrong interpretations of a parable, but there may be many right ones as well. It's kind of the point in pre-modern interpretation that I think is one thing we could learn from it. And not a great conclusion, but I've talked too long. Do we have, questions? Is there